Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast, brought to you by Lex Libertas. This is Ernst Roots. I once got into trouble for quoting the Holocaust survivor Victor Klemperer on what he said he would do if he could turn back time and if the tables were turned. Klemperer was a German philologist who was also Jewish, who of course was persecuted during the Holocaust and was said to have escaped a gas chamber by a near miracle. He was fortunate enough to survive, but many in his community weren't. He was also a diarist, and the accounts of his life are written down in a long series of fascinating diary entries. On the 16th of August, 1936, he wrote, "If one day the situation were reversed and the fate of the vanquished lay in my hands, then I would let all the ordinary folk go, and even some of the leaders who might perhaps, after all, have had honorable intentions and not known what they were doing. But I would have all the intellectuals strung up and the professors 3 feet higher than the rest. They would be left hanging from the lampposts for as long as was compatible with hygiene." Now, quoting this for historical and philosophical purposes, as hundreds, if not thousands, have done, is of course by no means an endorsement of the sentiment, and nor is it a call to violence. It is, however, an important perspective, because it underlines the fact that the friction between the ordinary people and the political elites, but more particularly the academic or intellectual elites, has been an ongoing matter. It is also important because it underlines the dangers of philosophy, of intellectualism, and, as Edmund Burke would say, of preferring theory above experience, or using theory to declare what reality ought to be, as opposed to using reality to shape our theories. And the quest to force reality into theory, of rejecting what we learn from the real world and our experience in the real world, and choosing ideology instead, has been the driving force behind some of the worst atrocities of the past century. This is particularly relevant in our day and age throughout the Western world, but also here in South Africa, where a small group of Afrikaner intellectual elites recently published a declaration that caused quite a storm. With this declaration, the group, comprising almost exclusively of academics, journalists, and some theologians, and people within their immediate circle of friends, stated that they distance themselves from the Trump administration, from those who have been campaigning outside of South Africa for increased pressure to be put on the South African government, and most importantly, that they reject what they describe as the narrative that Afrikaners are being persecuted in South Africa. This is not unique to the Afrikaners or to South Africa, but a phenomenon that plays out throughout the Western world, a phenomenon where ordinary people increasingly feel that their views and opinions are not represented by the elites, and where the elites increasingly feel that the people themselves are an obstruction to what they like to call progress. And so I want to respond to this with reference to the great debate between Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine about the French Revolution and how to make sense of it, and then with reference to the more recent works of Patrick Deneen about the fundamental difference between conservatism and progressive liberalism. But before we turn to the philosophical background of this divide between the people and the elites, it's worth pausing to look more closely at the declaration itself, this open letter by a group of 44 Afrikaner intellectuals that caused such a stir, but not just the declaration, also the arguments that were put forth during the debate that followed. Because beyond the immediate controversy, the letter and the arguments surrounding it reveal a particular way of thinking that is not new, but that tells us much about how the elite regard the people they claim to speak for. If we look carefully, it seems to me at least that there are about 5 main arguments that have been put forth, or perhaps 5 main assumptions that run through the letter and the arguments surrounding it. First, they see the issue almost entirely through the lens of race. To them, any reference to Afrikaner interests or identity is automatically racial and therefore suspect. They don't see or they don't want to acknowledge that Afrikaners is a cultural community or a nation. They merely regard Afrikaners as a group defined purely by skin color. And so from that perspective, any attempt to advocate for the rights or freedoms of the Afrikaner people is reduced by them to a whites-only agenda. It is thus not understood for what it is, a question of culture and the preservation of a cultural community. A community defined by language, heritage, and many other things than just race. In fact, one of the signatories, Janie de Villiers, went so far as to describe the Heritage Foundation in the United States, one of the most mainstream conservative think tanks in the world, and one which has expressed concern about minority rights in South Africa, as Christo-fascist. The assumption here is clear. Any conservative or Christian involvement in these matters must be extremist by definition. There is, in this worldview, no space for cultural nuance or the legitimate pursuit of self-preservation by a minority or cultural community. Second, the authors seem to believe that the American government has been fed false information. They imply that the United States has been duped by dishonest propagandists into believing that Afrikaners face persecution. Now, what this reveals is a rather astonishing naivety, or perhaps arrogance, about how international diplomacy works. They seem to think that senior officials in Washington are so gullible that they will simply fall in line with whatever story they are told. When Lindy Koorts, one of the signatories, was confronted with this claim, she defended this position by saying rather strangely that planting an idea by not saying it can be just as effective as saying it. It's a revealing comment. It tells us that the authors are not only suspicious of their opponents, but also of the very idea that ordinary people or foreign observers can arrive at independent conclusions based on evidence. The fact that they reject the evidence seems to lead them to believe that others should reject it too. And in as far as others do not do that, they believe that they have been fed with lies. Thirdly, they claim to be deeply offended by the tone of the debate, particularly by being called traitors or sellouts, and some derogatory statements that are even worse. They emphasize how saddened they are by the insults hurled at them, which, of course, they argue they don't deserve. Then they say that they will not stoop to the low level of these people they disagree with. They are not shy to insult in return, however. In fact, they use language every bit as personal and contemptuous when they hurl insults towards their opponents. They portray their critics as backwards, racists, Trump worshippers, dumb, unintelligent, idiots, and verkramp, to use the old Afrikaans word. They accuse others of lowering the tone of public discourse while doing precisely the same. One journalist who defended the letter and the authors thereof even claimed to be utterly concerned by the name-calling before proceeding to label people who disagree with him as AWB 2.0. So the moral hierarchy is clear. Their own words are principled critique, and everyone else's words are some form of vile hate speech or contempt. Fourth, the letter insists that white South Africans, and Afrikaners in particular, are better off and therefore have no reason to complain. This is framed as a moral argument. Those who criticize policies like black economic empowerment, they say are not arguing about principles, but simply seeking special treatment. Pierre de Vos, one of the most outspoken signatories, describes criticism of BEE as the fight against racial redress. The problem, of course, is that this caricature ignores the substance of the debate. It is not that Afrikaners refuse to help or to support redress. It is that they disagree with how it is being done. They question whether race-based economic engineering truly produces justice, or whether it simply entrenches new forms of inequality. To dismiss such objections as selfish is intellectually lazy and politically convenient. And fifth, perhaps most revealingly, the authors concede that democracy itself doesn't work in societies like ours. Pierre de Vos quotes research that when a country is highly diverse and deeply unequal, democracy tends to falter. He then adds that the problem is not the system, but that the Afrikaners aren't cooperating. It is a remarkable claim, one that sounds eerily familiar. It's the same logic used by every failed regime in history, that the broken system would be perfect if only the people would obey. It's the argument used by the ANC when they blame crime and farm murders on farmers who supposedly treat their workers badly. It's the argument used by every authoritarian movement of the 20th century. If only the citizens would stop resisting, if only they would hand over their property, their freedoms, their dignity, then peace would reign. It is the logic of the tyrant dressed up as moral progress. One of the signatories called on Afrikaners to stop the navel-gazing, to stop worrying about themselves. And yet, this is precisely what no other cultural group has ever been asked to do. Zulu people are encouraged to preserve their heritage, Xhosas do the same, and so forth. Black Americans are celebrated for affirming their identity. But Afrikaners, and whites more broadly, are told that self-preservation is immoral, that collective identity is racist, and that to care about one's own community is to betray the nation. Farm murders are responded to with claims that all lives matter. But people who say that all lives matter in response to political campaigns in the United States are responded to with contempt and accusations of backwardness and racism. This ultimately is what the letter represents. It's not a dialogue, it's disdain. It is the product of a class that has come to see its own people as an embarrassment, a relic to be apologized for, not a heritage to be honored. And this is why the debate about the people versus the elite cannot be reduced to policy or personality. It goes to something far deeper, to how the people understand themselves, and whether its own leaders still believe it deserves to exist. Edmund Burke was an Irish statesman and philosopher who lived in the 18th century. He was not only a politician, but also a thinker with a remarkable sense for how ideas shape societies, for better or for worse. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, many in Britain and across Europe hailed it as the beginning of a new age of freedom and equality. But Burke saw something very different. He saw the destruction of the tradition and culture on which civilization was built over centuries. This, he argued, was replaced by what he called the armed doctrine, a set of abstract theories opposed upon society by people who believed that they could reinvent human nature itself, by people who believed that their ideological preferences trump reality, and that reality has to comply with their dictates. This put him on a direct collision course with another renowned English writer, Thomas Paine. Paine celebrated the French Revolution. In his book, The Rights of Man, he declared that every generation had the right to tear up the social contract and start again from scratch. To him, tradition was a chain, and the past was a burden to be thrown off. Burke responded with his famous Reflections on the Revolution in France, in which he warned that such thinking would lead not to freedom, but to chaos and tyranny. People will not look forward to posterity, he wrote, who never look backwards to their own ancestors. This, for Burke, was the central issue, that a society is not a machine to be redesigned by clever people, but a living organism that grows over time, shaped by the wisdom and mistakes of generations. Burke warned that when societies abandon their moral and cultural foundations in pursuit of abstract ideals, they begin to unravel. He saw the French Revolution not as a noble uprising of the people, but as a movement hijacked by intellectuals who despised the old order and believed that they could construct a new one from theory alone. This is why Edmund Burke famously remarked, "Because half a dozen grasshoppers under the fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, whilst thousands of great cattle chew the cud and are silent. Pray do not imagine that those who make the noise are the only inhabitants of the field." In other words, it is often the loudest voices, not the wisest ones, that come to dominate political life, or in our context, media narratives. To Burke, Paine's mistake, and the mistake of the revolutionaries in every age, was to assume that reason alone could build a moral order. He believed that our reason, our ability to find macro-political solutions through sheer intelligence, is limited, and that we therefore depend on inherited customs, religions, and societal bonds to guide us. A healthy society, he said, is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. That partnership is the very opposite of what Paine and many intellectual elites imagined. It binds us to those who came before us and obliges us to act as trustees for those who will come after us. In that sense, Burke's argument was not simply against the French Revolution, it was against a certain type of mind, the mind that prefers theory over experience, that believes a good idea on paper can replace the slow wisdom of history. He saw in the revolutionaries the same spirit that we still encounter today. Among those who regard the past as irrelevant, who trust ideology more than lived reality, and who believe that a new society can be engineered from the top down. I want to take a moment to thank you for watching and following the content on this channel, and I also want to encourage you to like this video and to subscribe to this channel to ensure that our audience is broadened. In our day and age, the American conservative philosopher Patrick Deneen writes about the decay of Western political order through a Burkean lens, but written for a 21st century world. Deneen argues that what we are witnessing today in much of the Western world is not merely political disagreement, but a civilizational rupture. On the one side, there is an elite class, progressive, global, and managerial, who see themselves as the enlightened custodians of society, uniquely qualified to reshape the world according to their own ideals. On the other side are ordinary people, rooted in place, tradition, and family, who still measure right and wrong by the standards of common sense and lived experience. The difference between these two groups, Deneen writes, is not simply a matter of education or incomes or even intelligence, but of worldview. The progressive elite believes that progress means liberation. Liberation from tradition, from religion, from gender, from national identity, and even liberation from nature itself. They see history as a long struggle to escape constraint, and they view their own role as that of liberators, freeing humanity from the superstitions of the past. But conservatives, in Deneen's understanding, see things differently. They do not believe that freedom means the absence of limits. They believe that limits, moral, cultural, and even natural limits, are what make freedom possible. They see the human person not as a self-creating individual, but as a creature embedded in a moral and social order that precedes him. For Deneen, this difference explains much of the political turmoil of our age. The elite class believes it is advancing freedom, yet the world it creates is increasingly atomized, bureaucratic, and dehumanized. In the name of equality and progress, it concentrates power in the hands of experts, regulators, and corporations, producing a new form of oligarchy cloaked in the language of democracy. Meanwhile, ordinary people experience this as a loss of agency, a sense that their communities are being hollowed out and that their voices are ignored. They are told that their values are outdated, that their traditions are oppressive, that their instincts are dangerous, and their concerns are backwards. The more the elite speaks of inclusion and liberation, the more people feel excluded and bound. And so in Regime Change, Deneen argues that conservatism at its best is not a defense of privilege, but a defense of the ordinary, of home, duty, faith, and work. It is not nostalgic, but humane. It insists that real politics begins with the family and the community, not the abstract ideals of distant bureaucrats or the moral fashions of the university. The task of the new conservatism, he writes, is to reconcile the wisdom of the people with the responsibilities of the elite. In other words, a healthy political order cannot be built by destroying the ruling class, but by transforming it, by cultivating an elite that serves rather than rules, that listens rather than lectures, that loves its people instead of despising them. This, Deneen insists, is the challenge of our time, to bridge the gulf between the governed and those who are governing, to recover a form of leadership that is both rooted and responsible. The irony is that the modern progressive elite, which claims to speak for the marginalized, has become the most detached and self-righteous ruling class in history. A class that measures virtue by conformity to ideology rather than by service to the common good. In that sense, Deneen's warning echoes that of Burke, that when theory replaces experience, when ideology replaces community, when elites cease to see themselves as part of the people, they do not lead a society, they corrode it. Yet even Patrick Deneen's analysis, penetrating as it is, does not fully explain what we are seeing today. Certainly not in the South African context. It is because this divide between the people and the elite is not only political or philosophical, it is also deeply cultural, even psychological. For what we are dealing with here is not merely an elite that pursues progress for its own sake, but an elite that has come to despise its own inheritance. The British philosopher Roger Scruton coined a word for this phenomenon, oikophobia, which literally means the fear or the hatred of one's own home. It describes a pathology common among the educated classes of the West, a moral and cultural self-rejection, in which the traditions, symbols, and loyalties that once defined a people are treated not with gratitude, but with embarrassment or even disgust. Scruton warned that this impulse often masquerades as moral sophistication. Those afflicted with it convince themselves that to love their own culture would be a form of bigotry, while to denounce it is a sign of enlightenment, or verligtheid, as we say in Afrikaans. In South Africa, this disease has taken on a particularly striking form among a segment of the Afrikaner intelligentsia. We see it in the statements of commentators such as Piet Kroukamp, who once said that South Africa would be a better country if there were no Afrikaners at all. It is a breathtaking admission, not of self-criticism, but of self-hatred. And it is echoed in more polished academic idiom by writers like Lindy Koorts and Christie van der Westhuizen, who publicly insist that they still call themselves Afrikaners, but only as an act of protest or defiance, because they wish to redefine the term into something that no longer carries any of its historic meaning. What we find here is not simply disagreement about politics or policy, but a moral inversion. A generation of elites who have turned against the very culture that gave them their language, their identity, and their place in the world. They have convinced themselves that to reject their heritage is to be virtuous, and to honor it is to be reactionary. In doing so, they have confused humility with self-contempt, and cosmopolitanism with derecognition. This, of course, goes far beyond the normal self-critique that any healthy culture must exercise. It is one thing to acknowledge the sins or the failures of one's own people. It is another to declare that one's people themselves are the problem. And it is precisely this attitude, this belief that one's own civilization is uniquely guilty, uniquely corrupt, and uniquely unworthy of defense that now dominates the moral imagination of the Western academic class. It explains why so many intellectuals rush to apologize for their own history while remaining strangely silent about the crimes of others, why they attack their own traditions with passion and others with significant hesitation. Among Afrikaners, this oikophobic tendency expresses itself in a kind of moral exhibitionism, the public performance of self-denunciation. It has become fashionable in certain circles to say, yes, I am an Afrikaner, but not that kind of Afrikaner. The subtext, of course, is that the only acceptable way to be an Afrikaner is to repudiate Afrikanerdom itself. It is a tragic spectacle, an educated class so anxious to prove its moral purity that it is prepared to erase the very identity it has inherited. And so, while Burke warned against the arrogance of the rationalist elite, and Deneen warned against the detachment of the managerial class, we are now confronted with something darker still, an elite that not only rejects the wisdom of its people, but repudiates the very existence of that people as a source of meaning. This is no longer mere abstraction or technocracy. It is a form of cultural suicide, a determination to destroy one's own foundations in the name of progress. So where does all of this leave us? What are we to do when those who deem themselves our intellectual leaders seem ashamed of who we are? When our elites sneer at the ordinary convictions of their own people, and when ideology once again threatens to eclipse experience? The answer, I think, is to return to the kind of wisdom that Edmund Burke spoke of more than 2 centuries ago. Burke reminded us that the health of any society depends not on his theories, but on its lived experience, on the slow, humble accumulation of moral understanding that takes place in families, in communities, and churches long before it reaches the halls of power. He warned that once we begin to treat human life as a social experiment, once we allow clever men with big ideas to overwrite the inheritance of generations, we invite not progress, but ruin. That warning still stands. We cannot rebuild a society or defend a culture by drafting manifestos or waiting for politicians to save us. The work begins where it always has, in the daily practice of faith, responsibility, courage, and service. It begins when we live as though the truth matters more than fashion, and when we order our lives according to what we have learned from experience rather than what others demand of us in theory. For Afrikaners, and indeed for all people of South Africa who believe in self-governance, order, and moral integrity, this means staying true to the roots that have carried us through darker times than these. It means refusing to let others define us or to let guilt become a substitute for duty. It means drawing on our own traditions, our language, our history, our faith, not as museum pieces, but as living sources of strength and renewal. We should not be ashamed of these things. They are the very instruments through which we will find our future. To honor them is not to turn backwards, but to ensure that what we build next is real, that it grows from the soil of experience and not from fantasies of ideology. The task, then, is not to freeze time. It is not to remain stuck in the past, but also not to destroy the past. The task is to preserve what ought to be preserved, to stand against those who seek to destroy these things, and to build faithfully upon what we have inherited. And perhaps that is the calling of our generation, to think less like revolutionaries and more like trustees, to care for what we have received, to correct where we must, and to pass it on stronger and truer than how we found it. Because in the end, it will not be ideology that saves us, but virtue of character. Not theory, but experience. Not contempt, but love. Love for our people, for our culture, for our families, and for the hard-earned wisdom of those who were here before us. If you would like to support this channel and the work that we are doing at Lex Libertas to work toward a more sustainable and a more viable political dispensation for South Africa, I would like to encourage you to sign up as a contributor by clicking on the link in the description.